Good to go.
Excellent. Welcome to the WashingCon 2019 panel LARP, everything in between, and you. No, oh, woo, good, not a boo yet. Save that for Ghost Court. The thesis for this panel, like what I really want to get across to everyone here, is just that there's a huge diversity in LARP design, and that it definitely includes something that you will love. LARP is not for everyone, but I think it's for everyone who shows up to a LARP panel. We probably have something for you. Let's do a quick survey of the audience. Who here has done a LARP before as a participant? Oh yeah, you too. Nice, good.
600 or 700 hands raised.
Oh yeah. And then we have the extra 1,000 that haven't.
That's right. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, we are going to go through a few different genres of LARP to give you a quick taste. There are other genres because LARP is so big and weird, but we've already figured out who's going to be talking about which ones. We're going to tell you the general shape of them and also give you a couple good examples of LARPs that you can go play relatively soon, relatively locally, relatively cheaply, hopefully, that fit those genres. But first, I definitely want to introduce everyone here. First off, I'm your moderator, Marshall Bradshaw. I run the DC Area LARPers Facebook group that also occasionally has meetups, which is great because it's practice for this. I am also a theater critic. I have published a lot with DC Theater Scene, but recently have moved more to No Proscenium doing immersive theater reviews. And I published a extremely freeform game, the 200-word RPG challenge that you can only play while getting an MRI. And did I say he, him, his? Cleo.
I'm Cleo Yunsu Davis. I am a LARP writer and also tabletop RPG writer, which kind of plays into this a little bit because there's some crossover with Freeform Larp.
Yeah.
And I'm also kind of part of the international LARP scene, so I go to the Knutepunkt/Solmakota conference over in the different Nordic countries and kind of bring back what I learn here and vice versa. She, her, and they, them.
I'm Joe Hines. I've been LARPing for quite a while, various forms. I've done Parlor, which you'll hear about later, and Boffer Larp primarily, which I'll be talking about. I'm one of the directors of Lost Colonies LARP, which I will be talking about again later, and my pronouns are he, him.
Awesome. I'm Barbara Perez Marquez. I'm a writer, editor, and consultant. I'm part of Old Crone Studio, which is a diversity consulting firm for LARPs to help their inclusivity and diversity efforts. I've been LARPing for about 4 years now. Pronouns are she, her. That's it.
Yep.
And I'll be talking about some things.
Cool. And now that we are in our panelist and moderator speaking voice, how are our levels?
I think you're good.
Excellent. Thank you for your help. All right. Something that we're going to do this pretty quickly because I think this is going to be purposefully and entertainingly a train wreck. I want to hear each of your definitions of LARP in a sentence or two. And don't look too surprised. I warned you in advance.
Yep.
And sadly, Cleo, you're sitting next to me.
Therefore, I
You
have
get to go first.
You're standing up generally. That's usually how it's like when I'm trying to explain it to people who play tabletop games. I kind of start with the definition that it's like tabletop role-playing games, but you're on your feet generally, and you're embodying the characters. That's kind of the main thing. Because you could be sitting around the table. I would consider it a LARP if you are physically embodying the characters, even if you're just sitting there, like around the table, the way that you would be technically during a game, a tabletop game.
Yes. Joe, would you like to add to that? What's your
Yeah,
definition?
I think for me, some of the key things are that you are embodying a different person than yourself, even if that's a very thin veneer in some cases, and that the passage of time is an important portion of the mechanic because you don't stop to take turns in a combat scenario or roll dice or stuff like that. You're just kind of flowing, and it's in many ways has elements similar to improv if you've watched improv comedy, where there's no time to stop and say, hey, let me check on something. No, you just keep going with it. I mean, there are exceptions to every rule, but a key element for me is that real-time aspect.
Cool.
Yeah, so let's see. So we've got the not yourself element, the improv element. And I would add also that colloquially, I usually say if Disney World and Ren Fair had a baby, that's what LARP is. So you're in this created space where you get to sort of live on that, whatever fantasy is, whether it's sci-fi or actual fantasy or anything between or beyond.
Yeah, it's a shared fantasy. It's,
Yeah.
Everybody's agreeing to play in the same shared fantasy.
Yep.
I can even think of an exception to that one.
Yeah.
But, and a lot of people, when I first bring up LARP, they just think of the style of Boffer Larp, which is inspired by doing D&D, standing up, padded sticks, often think of people in the woods, in costume. But as you can tell from that definition, LARP is way broader than that and can fit so many things that might not even really be games as much as just improvised plays. Let's hit also why each of you LARP. To kind of pitch people on like, if it's so broad, why should we be interested in this? What do you get out of it? And do you want to go first?
I'll start and
Perfect.
not put clear on the spot always.
Take it, Barbara.
You know, I started LARPing because I wanted a social game where I could get out there and meet people and have something shared. At that point in time, I hadn't sort of found myself to tabletop RPG, but you know, like Kilio said, there is an overlap. So LARP led me to tabletop. And there was that social element where, you know, I like going to Disney World and I like going to Ren Fair, but Ren Fair is only three months of the year, and Disney World's really expensive. So somewhere in between, I was like, LARP sounds cool. So so there was that interaction. I wanted to connect to people and game with them, and that was a way to get out of the house and do it.
I started with tabletop and Magic the Gathering back when it was brand new. And through that, found a group of people who are also doing LARP. And so I got into it that way. And at first I was like, I don't have any idea what's going on here. Like, I wasn't an intentional LARPer to start with, but the idea of getting out and doing something different and role-playing while you're standing up and embodying the characters got me into it. And then I've stayed around for the community aspects and the friendships that you build out of it. And all of my best friends that I have right now, I met when I was first LARPing 20 plus years ago. And so it's a great way post-college to actually meet people who have a similar set of interests as you do. And you get to do things that you wouldn't normally do in your regular life as well.
Yeah, I think I have three main reasons, and I'm probably going to forget like at least one of them by the end of this.
Excited.
But the
All right.
first one is getting to experience intense emotions in a controlled environment. The second one would be self-discovery, because I don't think there's a single LARP, Freeform, or Blockbuster or otherwise that I've walked away from without having learned something new about myself. And sometimes that's because something in the character I realize is also true to my identity, or it's because something in that character is very not true to my identity, and that's still like a lesson learned. No, I knew it. Oh, and the third one is being able to experience a different world. And that could be a fantasy world, or that could just be another time period within our own actual history. But I find that really interesting and fun.
Yes, I agree with like all of these, especially like that rundown, Cleo. One thing that I would dig in on for a big reason why I LARP is the first time I ever LARPed was at this one convention, and in the weekend I did like these 3 LARPs in order, and I was coming to it as an actor. So for the first LARP, I really tried to think like an actor and think about my physicality and made this big, heavy character. And then for the next LARP, I got really light and kind of tried to go to the opposite end of the spectrum. And then for the third LARP, I wound up just playing myself, and in the game found an opportunity to just really meaningfully apologize to the best friend of my character because of how I like terribly hurt them. And being yourself and getting to practice that kind of intense emotional experience and social interaction that you do not want to screw up when you have to do it in real life meant so much to me. And as an actor, that was one of the only times that I've just cried during a performance. So a big part of why I LARP is kind of what you were saying, of experiencing those big emotions in a safe way and doing things that you wouldn't normally do in life. I love finding opportunities to practice being a good person, often by playing a bad person who then needs to learn to be better. So if you see Marshall at a LARP, half the time he will find an excuse to apologize to someone in character. So I'm getting pretty good at that. Let's go into our big, this is a LARP genre, this is what it looks like, this is the investment that you need to play, including how much it costs, and which ones we recommend. Like I said a little bit ago, LARP is frequently kind of thought of by people who haven't heard much as being those padded sticks in the woods, which is still potentially a very fun game. And I really want to lead off with that. So I'm going to hand it over to Joe to tell us about Boffer Larp.
So Boffer Larp, the name comes from the weapons that are used in the real-time padded weapon combat that is a major feature of that's the style of LARP. Typically they are full day or full weekend experiences where you are dressed up in costume, you are pretending to be knights or some other kind of martial combatant person, and they can be anything from like Darkon or Amtgard, where there's very little in the way of role play, and it's mostly just pretending to enact out combat scenarios in real time with your friends, up through which I'll put on the other end of it, frankly, Lost Colonies, which is what I run, where there's a lot of role play and combat becomes kind of a side or incidental portion of the experience, where danger exists in the world, and if you go into situations, they can devolve into combat, but they're not required to do so.
Cool. What sort of investment does it take to play in terms of time and cost?
Typically, a Boffer event ranges from a $40 per person entrance fee up to a couple of $100 it can be. Lost Colonies, we run our tickets at $75 for the full weekend. You'll also be investing in weapons and clothing, so there's an upfront cost to getting involved with it as well. A typical foam sword might cost you $50 to $150. You can go more expensive than that. And then you're going to be, having run fair level of costuming, so that can be anywhere from make it yourself out of thrift store finds that cost you 37 cents all the way up to thousands of dollars if you really want to get into it.
So there are people that can help with that, right?
There are definitely people that can help with that. And once you get into your chosen community for the Boffer area, there are plenty of people that are willing to help you source props or costuming, and they'll tell you what you need to bring to the event. Some of them are camping, where you're going to need a tent and your own sleeping bag and stuff like that. Some of them are more in a camp with cabins. And so you have to really find out with your particular community what the expectations are. Some of the local ones I've already mentioned, Lost Colonies. There's also the Eris Initiative, which is a sci-fi themed Boffer LARP with Nerf guns. And then there's Ascendia, which is a dark fantasy fairy tale kind of LARP. And Lost Colonies is a blend of fantasy and colonial America era level of technology. So we've got swords and Nerf guns, but characters can also think of there being like printing presses and kind of more advanced technology than the typical European fantasy Boffer LARP, which has been the baseline for so long.
I think one thing that stands out to me about Boffer LARP is kind of the one-shot versus campaign.
Yes.
It tends to really lend towards campaign.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that playstyle?
Sure. You tend to have a character that can last, multiple years. And a lot of Boffer LARPs will run monthly or every other month, and your character will earn experience points and grow over time, much like they would in tabletop. It's the closest analog to tabletop, I think, for most of the LARP styles that there are. And so people who are really like Dungeons and Dragons or equivalent games, Pathfinder, stuff like that, will find that there's a similar level of crunchiness to having stats on the character sheet, which are maybe not present in other LARP styles, because everything is a spectrum. Right. Did I answer your full question there?
Yes.
I don't want to chew up too much time, so.
We're pretty good on time,
Okay.
but I think that hits a lot. Especially, I'm glad that you mentioned Ascendia and what was the
Eris
sci-fi one?
Initiative,
Eris.
ERIS, yeah.
And they're both in Maryland?
All three of those are actually in the same campsite at Camp Westmar in Maryland. There are other camps, if you go south, there's Ascendant and Numina LARP, which use the accelerant rules system. So the two LARPs, same rule system, different styles.
Huh.
And
Another's Crux.
Crux, yes, Crux is also down south. And that's a fantasy, it's kind of a if you've seen Knights of Badassdom or Role Models,
Yep.
Crux is more in line with that, kind of what you expect there. As far as I've heard, I haven't been to that one personally, but I'm friends with the owner.
Then in that long list, which are the two that you would recommend that anyone interested in Boffer Larp Google right now?
So, Lost Colonies, because I run it. But it depends on what style I would say you're interested in. If you want pure fantasy European style, I'd go towards Crux or Ascendia. If you want sci-fi, go to Eris. If you want something different, go to Ascendia because they got their dark fantasy stuff. And then Lost Colonies has got its own thing. So pick the style of costuming that you think you would want to wear and the kind of character you want to embody, and then check that group out.
Since that will ultimately probably become an investment if the bug bites you.
Absolutely.
Cool. Let's go to Barbara for Parlor Larp.
All right. So, with Boffer, you're talking about outdoors activities, out in the woods, campsites, there was mention of that. Parlor Larps, usually played indoors, usually in a room akin like this. We'll stack the chairs, we'll hand out sheets at the door, and you'll play it out. Smaller commitment, usually one-shot style, 3 to 4 hours, akin to like a Dungeons and Dragons session, a Pathfinder session. But usually themes are less, again, exception to the rules always. It could be totally fantasy in a conference room looking space, but usually themes more social based. They're more interested in your characters interacting with each other as opposed to hitting each other with swords. Less crunchiness. There's usually just a couple of mechanics of nothing at all. And you're there for the social aspect of it. It could be anywhere from like dark Vampire the Masquerade style to like superheroes and high school themes.
Costuming?
Very versatile. Costuming can be, if you're ready at the convention that you brought your costume in, please costume all you want. But if the requirement is a modern setting, you can come with your clothes on. And if you don't have costuming, that's okay too. So there's a
Please
lot
wear
of
clothes.
Yes, just please wear clothes. Unless nudist LARP. Okay, no, just kidding. No,
I'm
no,
ready.
no. That's a different community. But there is this sort of relief, perhaps, the accessibility of it. Much more accessible when it comes to you don't need an upfront cost. More often than not, they're free, usually within the convention cost. So, WashingCon has one that's happening in this room afterwards. So stay and play. Or, you have your friends that travel to conventions. Anime conventions usually have designated rooms where there's just LARP going on all weekend, and you wouldn't even know that's happening. So, yeah.
Can you also touch on Parlor Larp is interesting because, by my understanding, it really runs the gamut from one shot to campaign. Can you maybe talk about things at either far end of that spectrum?
Don't have much experience with that, but with the campaign style. But yes, in theory, the stories build upon each other in the same way that they would in tabletop. It is less crunchy in the aspect that you're keeping track of the numbers of your levels. How much your weapon does, or damage-wise, or how much magic spells you have available for you. And more so about, who did my character meet? Who did they severe relationship with? And those things are tracked depending on the involvement of the narrative that you're playing. Like I said, some games, you'll play and you'll have that moment and it'll sort of just stay with you and everybody that was in that room. But you have different LARPs that might lend themselves to the opportunity to replay them, because that's the next session, that's the next encounter, it's the next council meeting, it's the next meetup of the minds. We have, I'm gonna butcher the name,
Miskatonic University.
Universities.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that one's like a college reunion. So every year you can come back to the game and you build this character that sort of spent a year out of this room, but you bring those experiences with you to play them out and see what happens.
I can talk a little bit about the campaigns and the Parlor as well.
Yeah, I was especially thinking about Vampire,
Right.
which has the campaign and some of the crunchiness from Boffer.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that, Joe?
Yeah, so I actually started off in Vampire Larps in One World by Night, which is a global LARP organization with multiple chapters. I think at one time there was 3 chapters in this area. There might still be that many, I'm not sure.
There's 3.
And then there's other similar organizations as well that have to operate on different rule sets. So with the One World by Night, you would have your local chapter, which would control your character and would control and limit how much experience points you would earn, but you could actually travel with that character to another chapter and play that character there. And then there's your local storytellers, and then there's the global level storytellers that control the narrative of what's going on in the whole world. And back when I was doing it, you could play every Wednesday night and every Saturday if you wanted to. And it was like $5 to go to an event, and the costuming was like just street clothes or whatever, you know, made you look goth-like. And it got really, really very crunchy. And some of my friends are still playing their characters that they've had for 20 years.
That's wild.
It's wild.
And I think that's definitely the one end of the spectrum. Barbara, would you like to tell us about a couple more Parlor LARPs you'd recommend, especially on the other end of the spectrum, if I was super interested but didn't want to have the almost Boffer aspect of repeating my character and having crunch that Vampire has?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I mentioned, there is Super Queeras, which is a superhero high school Parlor LARP. It was ran earlier this year, and it was created out of Massachusetts. So these games, the good thing also about Parlors is that you can run them yourself. You don't have to depend on other game masters, because the games are sometimes available online for free or at a small cost. So essentially you're just buying your rules book, and then you get 10 of your friends and you run it. I'll pitch myself. We have out of Old Crone Studio, we have a game in development that's a Parlor Freeform Larp that's called Godslayer, where you're gonna get to play a Greek goth at the end of the Greek god at the end of the world. So.
Cool.
And then you also have games like, I don't know, what other Parlor LARPs? Miskatonic is a Parlor LARP, created by Michael K. Young, who's local to the area. So he's got a bunch of different games if you want to look up his work.
Though currently it runs every 20 years. You mentioned that you find a lot of these at conventions. What conventions would you recommend that someone Google if they want to do that?
Yeah. Well, you've got, if you like your anime, you've got Otakon and Katsucon in the area. They both have LARP dedicated rooms. You've made it to WashingCon, congratulations. So next year there might be more LARP, you know. This is perhaps the first year with LARP panel, give or take.
2 years ago there was a LARP panel where they also did Ghost Court, so I'm just copying their homework.
So WashingCon, Intercon, if you like games. Gen Con's a gaming convention out of Indianapolis, not super close. LARPCon, awesome community.
They haven't run a LARP there yet.
They haven't run a LARP there yet, but that doesn't mean we can't. We had a LARP 101 panel there this summer.
2 years running.
2 years running. So, yeah.
Intercon that you mentioned, that is solely LARPs, and that is up in Rhode Island. It has a little bit of investment because that has costuming and reading world documents and really like putting some work before you start playing, whereas some you would just show up and play.
You show up and play. And usually your character sheet's one page. You know, these like more dedicated LARPs at conventions might sort of require you to do a little bit of homework, you know, 30 pages of game world, just so you understand what the immersion is like. And I think that's an important element no matter short or large LARP wise. There is an immersion element that we're all sort of interested in. That is less so, at the door you come in and play, but we want you to come in the door and you feel like you're transported into this world, Like, yes, this is a conference room, but imagine if it instead was a seedy bar in Chicago in 1920. Go. So.
Great. So it sounds like watch Old Crone Studios for Godslayer. Go to maybe a couple of these conventions, and when a convention has a LARP, just mob it to make sure that there's more LARP next year.
I also throw out NecoCon. They have a big LARP. They're down in the Virginia Beach area. And they've got a convention LARP that's kind of anime themed as well. So.
Cool. Well, let's hand it over to Cleo for Blockbuster.
Yeah, so Blockbuster LARPs tend to be, you've probably seen a lot of pictures from them on various social media. The biggest one here in the United States, I would say, is Magiscola.
Yeah, and was the first.
And was the first, really, kind of to be very inspired by Nordic LARP, and it's like a collaborative play style, very storytelling heavy, so you don't have like the crunchy rules and mechanics. And that's how many people would you say Magiscola is generally?
150, I think it fits per game.
Okay, yeah. And so that's been like all over the East Coast, and then they've had one in Ohio for Yule, and that's very much inspired. We can say it's inspired by Harry Potter, even though we just can't say it is Harry Potter.
They can't say it,
they
but
can't
we
say
can say
it,
it.
but we can say it. So we're not part of that business. And so in the U.S., there is kind of fewer options. So a lot of Blockbuster LARPs take place overseas. There was an X-Men one called Mart in England last summer. There's a bunch that happen in the Nordic countries in general, and they're like thematically they're going to be very all over the board. So you have Baphomet, which is like occult stuff meets Eyes Wide Shut meets like some really, it's like a very intense kind of darker experience. And then you have more like the X-Men LARP. There were heavy themes in that, of course, but it is a little bit lighter. You're using superhero powers. You have a lot more kind of control over the tone of your game. Pricing wise, these tend to get like very, very expensive, especially because if you're putting into account the travel costs, because you're flying overseas, you often want to be there a few days before and a few days after to deal with jet lag and traveling, so you have that cost and thrown in there as well. And then the actual price for the LARP itself is, they do have some subsidized tickets often per every, I don't think I've encountered a Blockbuster LARP that doesn't have at least a few subsidized tickets, but the average price, like there's a Hunger Games LARP they're talking about doing in Croatia in November 2020, and that's around like the €500 range. I think like 450 to €500, they're still figuring that out.
And it's kind of akin to a all-inclusive vacation, because
Yeah.
these are multi-day, include meals typically.
Yes, they
Include
they
housing.
should include meals and housing. Generally, also you have the costuming costs thrown in there as well, because these are kind of what they call 360 immersive experiences, where you're living in the world and everyone's expected to kind of be part of the backdrop as well as their own character. Like, you're there to lend credibility to the world.
One thing I'd add is there are definitely a lot in the U.S. Personally, I've worked on Real Royalty, that was in Ohio, Armistice Arcane in New Orleans. Magiscola is run by Learn LARP, that does also some spin-off games in the same kind of magical secret society setting. And they have one in Philadelphia right now. Magiscola is typically in Massachusetts. They did one in a cave in Kentucky for their Not Azkaban Wizard Prison LARP.
Didn't know it was in a cave in Kentucky.
Oh yeah, dude.
Yeah, it was the national park.
Subterranean LARP.
Can you talk a little bit more about, well, this is going to be tricky, especially with Magiscola, but you can talk maybe about other LARPs. One-shot versus campaign. Am I expected to go multiple times?
Right. So they're generally, more often than not, I guess complicated, more often than not, they are a one-shot. With Magiscola, and then also before with College of Wizardry, people will return as the same character. And some LARPs will have specific rules about this. Other LARPs will have very vague rules about this, so it gets a little confusing. But people will return as the same character over and over again, and it takes on a bit of a campaign feel because of that. And that could be once a year, it could be twice a year if you're going to like some of the kind of spin-off events as well. And they have a very different vibe, like the campaign Blockbuster Larps, since they have more of a history to pull from, and there's some ideas of like, oh, this is canon versus this is like not canon, what happened. That can get a little complicated, but most Blockbuster Larps are going to be this span of like 3 days, maybe 4 days. Everything is contained within that time frame. You can go back and play it again, but you're going to be playing a different character.
Right.
And something to think about with College of Wizardry and Wedge Schola, the way that they lend themselves to campaign is because the setting thinks about like a school year, right? Like you go to college a couple of years. Therefore, to a player, it's like, well, then that means that my character can be first year, second year, third year. What does that mean for the story of that character? But you have to think about that, like Cleo said, you know, they're contained environments, so the game still happens in whatever time frame A to B is the plot happening, and that doesn't guarantee that you have like the same classmates and all of those. There's a lot of layers when it comes to LARP and replayability, I guess. Even campaign LARPs, you know, yes, you commit to going Wednesdays and Saturdays, but your friend Jeff might not show up, and you know, you might see Anastasia once in your entire campaign. And that also refreshes the content. I think it creates some anxieties in some ways, but it also refreshes the content to make it replayable and make it unique every time.
Yeah.
So Cleo, do you want to sum that up in the like 1 or 2 or 3 that you'd really recommend? I'd love it if that list, given what we described as the purpose of LARP, included Jawl, just to like let people know how wild games can get.
Okay, so Jawl is going to take a second because when Jawl comes up, it requires a minute.
I invite you to talk about Jawl.
So like, yeah, if you want to stay in the country, definitely check out a Magic School event. That's going to reduce a lot of, you're not going to fly overseas, and also better for the environment. I'm talking way too close to the mic, I just realized. I just came back from Just a Little Lovin'. It's my second time I played it, and bear with me because it takes a second to really fully explain it. It's a LARP that takes place in the 80s, in the early 80s, over 3 different years. So every year it's a different 4th of July party, and it's in the LGBT plus community in New York when the AIDS crisis is kind of first getting full blown in that way. And when people, sometimes they hear about this, like, this shouldn't be a game, how dare this be a game? But the way that I approach, a lot of the people who created it and the people who play it approach it is that it's kind of, game might not be the right word for it. In the way that a lot of people think about it, it's kind of more of an immersive theater production in a sense, in that everybody is doing this shared storytelling together. And like, you wouldn't say, oh, this shouldn't be a play, or this shouldn't be a novel, or this shouldn't be a piece of art.
I like to use the word experience for that situation.
But people, I think, associate the word game with like, oh, it's frivolous, it's just for fun, like type 1 fun, not type 2 fun. You know, it's what?
Do you want to explain that really quickly in a sentence?
So type 2 fun is kind of like if you're going through a really like people will talk about that when they're like mountain climbing and stuff like that, when they're going through something that's really strenuous and not like, haha, like levity fun, like this is all jokes and stuff.
So it's tough to get through, but you're kind of happy that you did.
You have like a meaningful experience through it. And like, also I will say, like, Just a Little Loving does a lot of work to incorporate AIDS education as part of the experience, so that everybody who walks away ends up knowing a lot more than they did before. And I've seen a lot of people become AIDS activists as a result of having played in the LARP. And what was the other thing that you wanted?
That is so super cool. I love that game so much.
Other games,
Other games,
and the deal with Just a Little Loving is you kind of have to just be on the lookout for when it's going to happen.
Yes.
Different people will run it, different times, different places on the globe.
Yes. So they did it once in the U.S. in Minnesota 2 years ago. Then it's been all over the place. There's been one run that was in French. There's another run that's going to be happening. I don't know if I don't know, like, if it's public information, so maybe I won't say it. But like, it happens all over. It just happened in London, or not in London, but somewhere in the UK that's very north of London, like near Stafford. And it would make sense for them to do it near New York because it takes place in Sarasota.
Boy, I sure hope someone has that idea.
The idea has been had. It's just whether or not it's going to happen.
And what are one or two other ones that you recommend? Maybe give a little bit more specifics about how to get into Magiscola.
Yeah, so Magiscola, again, like you can check out the Learn LARP website and also all their Facebook pages because they will have continuous updates about whatever the next events are. I am not as tapped into that now as I used to be, so I don't know what necessarily. And Imperial Magiscola is happening right now, so sorry you missed that.
I missed it.
I mean, if you drive now, you could be an NPC probably.
Yeah.
But I think, I guess what I would say there is they have all these spin-offs. Maybe look up Magiscola or Learn LARP online and
Yeah.
do one of the typical main games. Jump in there, and
I will also
it
say
happens generally in the summer in Massachusetts.
Yeah, Learn LARP also runs smaller convention LARPs,
Yep.
based in the same universe, so you could get like a taste of that there. They do it at like Dreamation, I think. They're going to do it at Big Bad Con out in Oakland,
They were at
California.
Gen Con.
Yeah.
And they also have, talking about, how the Blockbuster hark back to LARP, to Parlor. Learn LARP has a Wolf by Any Other Name that is sort of a self-contained Parlor LARP that they created that is essentially a spin-off of things that happen in detention at the Big LARP. So, you have that relationship where people go to conventions and play their characters from the summer because the game doesn't constrain the fact that, if you want to rename your character and name it your student, go for it. And you get to relive those experiences through mods,
That's
essentially.
fantastic.
Is there one more that you want to recommend, Cleo? Like maybe, so Jal is everywhere. Magiscola is here in America. You have a lot of experience in LARP in Europe. What's the one you'd recommend that someone pay the ticket to fly to Europe to play?
I think they're running Marked again, and I really enjoyed Marked, which was the X-Men. Again, they can't say it's X-Men. I can say it's X-Men.
Yes.
LARP that took place again also near Stafford in a big old manor house that looked very thematically correct. So I think that they're running that again. There was no. I would say keep an eye out for it. I am also personally keeping an eye out for the Hunger Games LARP, which is not also not. They can't say it's Hunger Games.
What would I Google if I wanted to find it?
Triumph LARP, and that's going to be on Facebook. And they're kind of steadily releasing more information about that.
Cool. What do you have, Joe?
There's a Stormwrecked LARP, which is a pirate-themed Blockbuster LARP coming up in 2020.
Where's that?
That's going to be in one of the, like a resort. They're renting like a seaside resort somewhere in the East Coast of the U.S.
I'm pretty sure Virginia Beach.
Is it Virginia Beach? Okay.
There you go.
I know that's coming up.
I'm also positive almost positive they're going to do Inside Hamlet again, which takes place in Elsinore Castle, where you play either a canon character from Hamlet or somebody who would be likely to live in that universe, and you run around the castle being tormented, and then drama happens.
That one's really high on my list.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to stick with you and hit Freeform LARP, which is very similar to Parlor. There's a lot of overlap. You even said Freeform at one point, Barbara, and I was like, crap. But can you tell us a little bit more, Cleo, about Freeform LARP and how people use that word and maybe some really unique games in that style?
I will say first that the word freeform will cause a lot of debate in a lot of circles about LARP because people will say, what does that even mean? There's a lot of similarities between like the Swedish Jeep form LARP genre, which is, I say they're very similar. Some people will have like very little like nuance.
Too jargony. That's LARP 201.
But essentially, I would describe it as it's very broad. It's a LARP that's generally very low mechanics, like not a whole lot of crunchiness involved. Sometimes there will arguably be no mechanics. And it's a little bit more of like an improv exercise that way. And if you want to check them out, there's the Golden Cobra Challenge that happens yearly, and their website has every submission ever, and then generally people will look at the winners from each year to see what they like from that, but there's also like a lot of submissions outside of just who won or got an honorable mention that are really, really good. So you have a huge catalog to draw from there, and that's free. You just look at that website and you get it for free. And running it technically could be free if you just get it with your friends in a living room somewhere. Or you can play it at a convention and you have whatever the convention fee is there. Dreamation has a bunch of them.
Where's Dreamation?
Dreamation's in Morristown, New Jersey, which is pretty close to New York, like 45-minute drive out of New York City. double exposure events. I've not been to DexCon, but Metatopia will also have some LARPs, I believe.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. They'll have experimental ones where people are playtesting them.
Yeah, so that's the big playtesting.
And that's
one.
in the same hotel by the same company as Dreamation.
Yeah, double exposure. And double exposure also does some. They have like a playtesting hall, but I think that's different. It's not LARP at Gen Con, but they have a presence like at a lot of different other cons. So you might know them through that.
I think it's most useful to define it in contrast to Boffer and Blockbuster, and this has a lot of overlap with Parlor, but in saying what it doesn't have.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't have, of course, like flying to Europe, it wouldn't have costumes, it wouldn't have any crunch or character sheets.
They might have character sheets.
Might have, yeah.
Mine has character. Most
That's
of mine
fair.
have character sheets, and they can be anywhere generally between like it can be an hour-long nano LARP. So if you want to look at hashtag feminism, that's Lizzie Stark's the editor, one of the editors at least on that. There's a bunch of very small, very short LARPs there, and the idea is that they're easy to run. You just read it, and you don't really need like props and things like that. It just takes like one read through, and then some of them are completely GM-less too. And yeah, generally they're between 1 hour all the way up to 6 hours. I don't know if I've ever been in a freeform that's been longer than 6 hours. I'm sure they exist. But with Golden Cobra, for instance, I don't know if it's been every year, but there's usually criteria that the game has to last no longer than 2 hours. So that's if you're looking for kind of like that experience, a sample of freeform LARP, it's good to kind of go through the Golden Cobra site.
And for Golden Cobra, they're all on there for free, generally built to be as little prep as possible. That type of time, for me, that's typically what I recommend number one to anyone interested in LARP is like, check out some favorites on that website. What's one or two that you like on Golden Cobra Challenge?
So Still Life is like a favorite of everybody if you want to play a rock. That's Wendy Rose Gorman. I don't remember who else she co-wrote that with.
I don't know.
And if you want, I don't want to, okay. Wendy also has another game that's, are we cursing here? Is that okay?
Can we curse? Is everybody cool?
I mean, I know
Fuck,
we're being
it
recorded.
looks great,
Okay,
yeah.
so she has a game called Beast Fucker.
Oh, no.
As the door opens, I said, Beast Fucker. Which, if you want like a Rosemary's Baby type experience, that's something that's very different from Still Life, but it's a very, very good game. I think it was an honorable mention in 2017.
So
Yeah.
Still Life I'd want to play if I wanted a kind of quieter, simpler experience.
Yes.
And then Beast Fucker I'd
That's a
play
very
if I
long-
wanted dark and intense and sexual.
Yeah, pretty much.
Anything else that you want to pitch within Freeform?
Well, Golden Cobra Challenge is soon going to be open for submissions if anybody wants to try their hand at writing a freeform LARP. I don't know exactly yet when we are posting all of the award categories, but I am on the judges committee, so if you want to talk to me about that and ask questions, I can answer those.
Heck yeah, so
Afterwards,
that's
yeah.
goldencobra.org for that.
Yeah.
Then I want to, the last one that we're going to hit, though I'm tempted to bring up, well, let's hit this first.
Stay on target.
Thank you, Joe. Barbara, can you tell us about a genre of LARP that I think breaks a lot of the rules and expectations, digital LARP?
Sure. So it's 2019, so you probably have a computer that has integrated a webcam and a mic, which we perhaps didn't have back when Boffer started. Joe, can you speak to that? I'm
We
so
did not
sorry.
have those.
So,
Back when rocks were new.
you know, but when you think about LARP, you think very low tech, character sheets printed out, like your phones are put away. So as we sort of found that technology can lend itself to diversity, accessibility, gaming, in the last couple of years, we have something come up that's been sort of denominated as a digital LARP. It's a LARP that happens in the digital world. That's the simple answer. You've got games that take place essentially on your screen. What you can see on your screen from your webcam is your play space, and you're playing with other people online. That has evolved very quickly from that essentially it's like you in a room interacting with people online, to LARPs adapting those technologies to include them in their games. So you have the Geek Initiative, right?
Yep.
Yeah, the Geek
Yeah.
Initiative LARPs is essentially, I don't want to say like they were the first, but they're definitely like the louder voice in the digital LARP. So they have several different games, so there's a little bit of everybody. You can still play sci-fi themes with tech. They have a vampire game that it's essentially you waking up and sort of like communicating on social media. They have an independence game that's coming up. You know, like, just because you're playing with technology doesn't mean you can't still play with fantasy themes, play with older historical themes and all of that stuff. But you also have games that are coming out, for example, from Sinking Ships, that is adapting technology into their games. So they have roles where you can play out of your house, essentially. Characters are solely online while people are in a different space live.
That's the cyberpunk one?
Yeah, they have a
Scapegoat.
cyberpunk.
Scapegoat, thank you.
And it's typically called remote play, so there will be local play that's a more typical LARP, but you're on Discord or something and
Yes.
can influence what's happening.
Yes. And Event Horizon, which is out of Massachusetts, but they play in California. It's kind of confusing. They have two hubs, essentially. But they also have the remote play, and they created their own interface, essentially, that's part of the game that plays with their sci-fi teams, and it's all like on like smartphones and tablets and all that stuff. And what that's really allowed is for people to sort of dip their toes when they're not ready to make the commitment, when they're not ready to pay the ticket, the airfare and all that stuff. But you still get to play with those themes and say, you know, you play Chariot out of the Geek Initiative that I played, that Josh has played. You know, it's sci-fi, we're all leaving the planet and sort of contending with those themes, and then you say, oh, I like the space aspect. Great. Then there's also these other games that exist that are live. You know, you play First Bite and you say, you know, like, LARPs and vampires sound really cool, so you might find yourself at your Vampire the Masquerade chapter the next, you know, cycle that they have for new players and all that stuff. So that's what's really allowed that. Usually all you need is like your computer, mic, webcam, connection to the internet. Props, very light. It's essentially like what your camera can capture. Sometimes that could be a blank wall behind you, or if you want to put props that people can look about, that's fine too. Entry point, you know, they can be anywhere from subsidized tickets, even for something as low tech, as this, to, you know, you're paying like $50, which will include several sessions. So one of the Chariot runs that I played was several sessions. So there were about 5 sessions that told a full story. So, and these sessions are 3 hours long online. So there is, again, that play between campaign and one shot, where the story is contained, but it doesn't necessarily have to be you sitting at a computer for 8 hours to tell the whole story. You can piece it out and still tell a full story.
Great. So the Geek Initiative is a kind of preeminent voice there. Look for remote options for Blockbuster Larps.
Yep.
I definitely want to hit, we're a little low on time. I want to make sure we have time for questions. And since this is being recorded, and I think this is going to be a really useful tool to be able to link to people who want to learn about LARP, I'll be repeating any questions into the mic and then handing it off to our panelists. Does anyone, especially the people who have not LARPed before, have any questions, maybe terms that were confusing or things we want to drill down and make sure we find a LARP for you?
No pressure.
I do have a question, just like that I've LARPed before.
Yeah, go for it.
What is the difference between a digital LARP and playing your tabletop game with heavy RP? Let's say you don't have combat in your D&D session. What's the difference between doing the remote LARP and playing your D&D session on Discord?
This is a super juicy question. So for the sake of the recording, digital LARP, what's the difference between it and just a really immersive tabletop experience?
The name of the title, if you ask me. Again, I'm no like end all be all, but you know, nowadays you have that overlap with RPG and LARP that are interested in that immersion and that interest. But the reality of it is that your tabletop table might not necessarily have the same levels of immersion. So you might have a player that's more interested in being the murder hobo, whereas you're really interested in embodying your half-elf and understanding the really struggle of their story. And that's okay, you know, like in tabletop, there is no problem for that difference to exist. Whereas in LARP, how Marshall, I think you were the one that said it at the beginning, everybody that's LARPing in that moment is there for the LARP. So whether you're more extrovert or introvert, that's not the problem. but there is an understood interest in this is here for the story. Whereas an RPG session might be getting through the social keys and telling that story.
I'd like to add on to that, if that's okay. With Digital LARP, one of the aspects that I've understood, I haven't actually done one, but I've talked with Tara extensively about this, is that the interface that you're talking into and you're viewing is actually part of the world, as opposed to a tool that's allowing you to connect to the other players. It's a part of your world. It is your viewport into the LARP itself. So your keyboard, your mouse, your monitor are part of that aspect. In Chariot, for example, you're all playing people who are on a rocket ship. So you're sitting down at your station in the rocket ship, right? And so it helps you get a little bit more immersed versus using like a Roll20 to play your tabletop D&D game where it's a tool to facilitate the gameplay remotely.
I love this because I'm of two minds on it. My first mind is Joe and saying like, if you have a webcam on you, then you are physically embodying your character. You are acting. When your body moves, that's how your character moves. But then the other answer in my mind is Barbara's answer, which is that, definitions are blurry and that's okay. And your
Absolutely.
tabletop is probably a little LARPier than you think it is.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I'd say if you enjoy doing Roll20 and playing, some kind of tabletop experience through the web where everybody's remote, give Digital LARP a try because it's a good, easy transition.
Also great for accessibility,
Totally.
since as long as you can get on a computer, you're good. Do we have any other questions, especially like, how do I find this type of game?
What kind of LARP options are there that are Washington, D.C. Metro accessible?
Ooh, limiting ourselves only to the Metro. One big thing is my group, DC Area LARPers, is just a Facebook group where people will post games that they have coming up, and we try to have all our meetings be Metro accessible so that way you can Metro to meet other LARPers. That's not the game itself.
Yes.
I think
That's just
one
a
answer
resource.
is Freeform Larps.
Yeah. I ran Deranged, my favorite scenario, in Marshall's living room, so.
Yes, plenty of LARPs that can
Yeah.
happen without even leaving your apartment. But any other recommendations?
I'd say-
Conventions in the area.
Yeah, I'd say also the Parlor Larps in the vampire scene are generally within, they're like Falls Church or, in Maryland
Club
somewhere.
Orpheus in
Yeah.
Baltimore.
The Parlor Larps are more likely to be found in and around the
Metropolitan area. Yeah,
metropolitan
they're
areas.
metropolitan. They're sort of contained in spaces that you would otherwise like. Oh, I didn't know there was a LARP here every Sunday. But they're community spaces that are accessible to LARP organizers, which is sort of a key way to figure out how to make a game happen. It's a community space.
Also carpool.
Also, I was just going to say the Boffer Larps that I mentioned before are about an hour or so outside of DC. And there are people that will carpool to take you to those events if you don't have access yourself. But they are a bigger commitment in getting out there and spending more time. And that's just because there's no campgrounds within metropolitan areas for those things to occur. LARPs very much will take the form of the space that they have available. Like water or cats.
Any other questions? Then let's hit reintroductions and maybe like as few LARPs as you can say that you would definitely pitch people to try. I'll start with myself and the LARPs that are literally in front of me. I was Marshall Bradshaw. I run DC Area LARPers, also do immersive theater reviews. Check me out on No Proscenium and on Twitter at DMarshallB. LARPs that I'd recommend are, you could try LARPing by staying in this room. If we have enough people, I'll just do Ghost Court. This is a freeform, arguably parlor, I would say freeform LARP, that is very improv-y and just fun, and you could spend the entire time in the audience and still be doing it right. This is the game that I would most recommend to everyone, Sign. It is a 2-hour game that you run in a dining room and a living room. It is a freeform in which you do not speak. You instead play children who create a sign language from scratch. And this is inspired by the actual creation of Nicaraguan Sign Language, so you'll learn a thing or two while you have an experience that both puts a new wrinkle in your brain while also really warming your heart, because you're just a bunch of kids who really need to talk to someone. And you will find a way to do that.
My favorite LARP ever is called Deranged by Maria and Jeppe Bergman Hamming, and it's about Robert Schumann and his, oh my god, Clara Schumann, I couldn't remember her name for a second, Felix Mendelssohn and Johannes Brahms. It's very stressful, sad, but it does take a lot of prep generally, so you have to print the whole thing and put it on the wall, but I definitely
But no prep
recommend.
for players, right?
No prep for players, just the poor GM. So I definitely recommend taking a look at that. And if you want a LARP about, a Golden Cobra LARP about K-pop, then you can check out my game, The Long Drive Back from Busan, which is about a dysfunctional K-pop boy group going to a music festival and falling apart and all that.
And both of those are free online.
Yes, that's Golden Cobra, that one best game with non-romantic relationship something.
Excellent. Jeff.
Did you want to reintroduce yourself?
Oh,
as
I'm
well?
Cleo. You can find me at CYS Davis pretty much everywhere.
Perfect.
So I'm Joe Hines. As I said before, I'm one of the directors for Lost Colonies LARP. We're a fantasy colonial blend boffer / Parlor Larp blend LARP that happens in Sibyllsville, Maryland. I would also recommend you check out the DC Area LARPers Facebook group that Marshall mentioned earlier, as well as the brand new Mid-Atlantic LARP Community Facebook group that's starting up. And also I have created a Mid-Atlantic LARP 101 Facebook group. If you have follow-on questions, that you're welcome to join as well. Check out Eris Initiative, check out Ascendia, check out Lost Colonies. If you're farther afield, check out Crux, or Legends of the Seas is starting up. And in there you have sci-fi, dark fantasy, colonial fantasy, and pirate. So you should be able to find something that you like.
That's good. Okay, I've been Barbara Perez Marquez. I'm a writer, editor, and consultant. You can find me online anywhere at Mustache Babs. I also have cards up here about myself and Old Crone Studio, which is the collective I'm part of. We're creating a game called Godslayer, which will probably be run out of Baltimore City. You can also check out Lost Colonies, which is pretty dope. I've been part of New World Magiscola, which I highly recommend. It was my very first LARP, so don't be scared to take the plunge, I guess is part of my advice. You can start big or start small, but start somewhere and you'll find a friend. I think that's the important part.
What a great note to end it
Woo!
on.
Not every LARP is for everyone, but everyone has a LARP that's for them.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists and to our recording
Yeah.
and to all of you for coming out. Thank you so much.